All right, if you want to get a cup of tea or coffee, this is your chance. Some of you have acquired the habit of bringing coffee pots to your table, which is probably a good thing for those of you that drink a lot. We don't have quite enough teapots to do that yet, but if I convert you all, then we'll be ready. Then you will be ready. While people are moving around a little bit, one of the questions asked, are there figures from the New Testament that you were wondering about? And one group had Pontius Pilate, so I could mention a little bit about him. Did any of the other tables have other people? Mary Magdalene and some of the women. That's another good one. Anyone else? Pontius Pilate, Mary Magdalene. Okay, I better make sure I have a moving bar. That is good. That means I have sound. Always have to make sure that you have sound, because re-recording the whole thing isn't a lot of fun. So Pontius Pilate, the historical tradition about him is a little bit thin. In, I think, about 36 AD, he is called back to Rome from Israel and sort of fired and punted to the side. He dies a relatively obscure death, I think. We don't ultimately know what happens to him, but Pilate was a political figure who was very political. That good old phrase, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, seems to have applied in the case of Pontius Pilate, that he liked to play the political game. And so he gets caught in the Wheel of Fortune. Anyone know where the Wheel of Fortune comes from? Deacon Paul does. Yes, you talked about it in diaconate formation. Maureen might remember as well. The Wheel of Fortune shows up in a text called The Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius. And he talks about how if you play the political game, it's like spinning the Wheel of Fortune. And the problem with the Wheel of Fortune is that no matter how good you're doing, eventually you go bankrupt and lose it all. And so you don't get to stay on top of the game forever. Eventually, the game eats the people that play it. And that seems to have happened to Pilate. He does all these political things, he has all these machinations with the Jewish people, and eventually the Romans just sort of smash him and move on. Mary Magdalene. So there's a very, very old tradition that is non-biblical, but that Mary Magdalene and Lazarus go to France. That they make a journey to France I think it's after Martha dies. If I remember right, Martha is supposed to have died earlier. There aren't a lot of historical documents from that time period that you can directly reference, but there are curious things. There's an area of Paris where there's a train station now on the western side of the city called Saint-Lazare, which is French for Saint Lazarus. And it's been known as Saint-Lazare as long as record keeping goes, as far back into history as you can get, which at the very least means that the tradition of Lazarus coming there is very, very, very old. Is it something that I would take to the bank? Not necessarily. He might have lived next door in the other town and the Parisians just kind of borrowed him. But there is strong evidence to believe that they made it there. In France, Mary Magdalene gets a special name, La Madeleine, where Madeline comes from, the name. I'm not sure exactly why she gets that name or how it happens, but somehow translating Mary Magdalene from Hebrew into Greek into French becomes La Madeleine. And so that's how she's known. And one of the more famous churches in Paris now is the Church of the Madeleine, which is close to the Champs-Élysées and the Louvre. It's on a boulevard in the center of Paris. It's a very famous example of neoclassical architecture. It's a dark and kind of strange church. It's not much of a church that you would like to go to because you can't see inside very well, but it's one of the most fashionable churches in Paris. It's where all the wealthy want to get married, and who knows why, because, there's like Notre Dame, which is beautiful. There's lots of other beautiful churches, and they picked that one, which the outside is really, really famous. It looks like a Greek temple. The inside is pretty dark. But they have like a big bone of St. Mary Magdalene, a relic display in the church. And I'm not sure if they claim that's exactly where she died, but it could be. Some of those things are probably a little bit less reliable. But there's very, very funny things in history that is actually kind of the first thing that we have to talk about. I'm thinking of another Paris one. So one of the patron saints of Paris is Saint Denis, Saint Denis. And the tradition is that he was a martyr, and they cut off his head, and then his body picked up his head and walked for like 4 miles out into the countryside, and eventually dropped it at a place, and they built a basilica there. So if you go to Paris now, you can go to the Basilica of Saint Denis, which is a very famous spot where all of the kings and queens of France were buried, and it's ways north of the city. And the tradition is that his body carried his head out there. It's just, history is full of these stories, and I would suggest to you that they're probably not all true, but I would also suggest to you they're not all false. One of the problems that we have is how records are kept. It's important to remember that history is written by the victors. When you win the battle, you get to write how it went. And it was also written by people that were educated. Modern society, especially after the French Revolution, would have you believe that almost no one in the ancient world was educated in any fashion. That is not true. However, education wasn't as widespread as it is now. In the Jewish community, it was stronger because they had a sense of learning to read the words of God, because God wrote words. He spoke, and they wrote it down. And there's a stronger connection to culture that way. Jewish rabbis became school teachers in many ways. Synagogues, if you remember, we've talked a few times about how synagogues were a lot more of a combination between an ancient school and a church than just a church, like we would think of them now. And they had a role in education. The rabbi would often teach village children, especially those that were not involved in trades. But sometimes our historical records are a bit thin. And this is a problem that we face in history. And it's kind of, there's no way around it. We don't have perfect historical records of all kinds of things. We don't know exactly when a lot of it happened, because despite what you think in the modern world, we've changed dating systems probably 5 or 10 times since these events happened. And anytime you change a dating system and rewrite everything that came before, you're bound to miss a few things or put them in the wrong year or the wrong spot, which is probably, for instance, why Jesus is likely born around 4 BC, give or take. 3 or 4 BC is the most likely, because the person that made the calendar and started counting years wanted to hit the birth of Jesus and missed, as nearly as we can tell. And they've never changed the whole dating system again to fix it. So it could really be, 2028? If we recounted, but, years go by fast enough already, so we don't have to add new ones. But this is a challenge that we're going to face. What was the early church like? When we start talking about the early church on the ground in Israel, and as it starts to spread, what are the Pauline communities like? We don't really know. I mean, we know some things, but there's a whole lot that we don't know. Well, why don't we know it? Because they didn't write it all down. We just don't have the records. They're fewer and further between than that. And so the sort of canonical tradition of how Christianity develops would give you a sense that lots of issues were kind of figured out and then everyone believed them all at the same time. Is that very likely? No. Please say no. It's not the way it works. Even in our own day, if you think of the Second Vatican Council, in the last, 50 years, 60 years, however long it's been a while since it happened, people are still trying to figure out what it actually said. If you think that that didn't happen in history when there were far less records and far fewer things that were actually written down, you're fooling yourselves. You know, so what is a parish church like in the first century? We don't know. How many scriptures do they have? We don't know. It's very evident that the Christians start working on a standardization process that begins, but there's all kinds of things. Like, there was a lot more liturgical variety in history. The liturgy was celebrated a little bit differently in different places. The major pieces were the same. It's not that we're throwing out babies in bathwater, but there were little differences where the priest stood, what he said, you know, what phrases he used, those kind of things. That was very widespread until a man named Charlemagne comes around. A great date to remember for him is 800. It's when he was crowned Holy Roman Emperor in Rome. He's a bit before that and a bit after that, but it's a nice round date that's easy to remember. He began a project with, I think, Alcuin of Rede, or Alcuin of York, who's a British guy, a British monk, to standardize things throughout his realm. He wanted there to be one Mass and it to be celebrated the same everywhere, which sounds like a good plan. So to do it, he bulldozed and burned everything down and said, you're going to do it my way because I'm the king. And the Pope even said so you have to listen to me. This is the way it works. Now, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, there's an effort called the Carolingian standardization. And there's even things like that's when Gregorian chant changes. If you're used to Gregorian chant, modern Gregorian chant, all dates from the time of Charlemagne. If you listen to older stuff than that, they have multiple lines and they have a basso continuo, it's called, and they have other parts. It was much more polyphonic sounding before the Carolingian standardization. And there's things like that. And even he is credited with doing this. It didn't all happen in a year. It probably took about 3 or 4 decades.
But this isn't the first time you're trying to standardize. I mean, you go all the way back.
No, but this is also kind of that secondary point that there's things in history that have shifted and that have changed. And it's a lot harder to say, like Benedictine monastery in 600 AD in France, what was it like? Well, it was like Benedict, and it was kind of like Benedict in life now, but it was probably also a bit unique. It was different, and we don't always know. And that's okay. That's just the historical project. Now, some of the problem that I would have with modern scholars, including our author, he falls into this a little bit, is that they doubt the sources that come from tradition. So, for instance, what the role of Peter was. He kind of holds a minimalist view of Peter and really exalts Paul in the text. That's very, very academic. And it's not necessarily wrong. That's one possibility. This is one of the challenges. There's different readings of history. So one possibility is this kind of academic thing that the papacy changed greatly as it transitioned from the ancient Roman Empire into the Dark Ages, into the Middle Ages, into the High Middle Ages, that there was a great standardization, that the Pope became much more like a monarch and monarchical things got integrated into it. Was some of that there from the beginning? I would argue, yes, it's very, very possible, but you can't say with perfect certainty exactly what happens, because some things become legendary, some things change, some things develop, some things grow, some things we get rid of. I think one of the greatest events in the history of the papacy is the reunification of Italy, when they made the Pope no longer a temporal ruler of Italy. It was good. The Pope went back to the Vatican and locked himself in a castle for a while and started writing, and actually became much more Pope-like. Instead of leading armies around and killing people, they started reflecting on the life of Jesus and started writing encyclicals. And that was a helpful thing. It's the genesis of giving someone like St. John Paul II, who we celebrated today, the ability to travel around the world and to function as a spiritual leader of people, because he's not in charge of a country. I would argue that's a good thing. You could argue differently. Some people argue it differently. That's okay. But it did change rather dramatically in the unification of Italy And Charlemagne, that good old king, is the one that gave the Pope a bunch of land, and they claimed it was older, and there's all kinds of stuff. We'll get there eventually, I hope. But I didn't think I was going to write 15 pages of notes either, and we have barely even started them. So, the Yeah, what is a Christian church like before the death of Jesus? That would be another one that one could argue we don't know. You know, what did the people that encountered Jesus and started to believe in him as Messiah do? Did they continue to attend synagogue in the same way that they did before? Did they continue to worship in the temple? We know that the sacramental life of the church largely doesn't begin at best until the very last days of the life of Jesus. The Last Supper is the traditional start of the Eucharist and ordination of priests. Some of the other sacraments, you can at least be suspicious, like baptism. It seems like the disciples did some of at least the baptism of John, if not the baptism of Jesus. But remember, at this time, there's no New Testament. Nothing that we have has been written. There's Old Testament, but even that is held on scrolls. And not every synagogue has every scroll. Only the wealthiest ones and the ones in Jerusalem probably were able to afford them all, but they would try to have the major ones. You know, would they pray the book of Psalms? That's very, very likely. Jews did that. That was very, very common. But you know, there weren't churches in the sense that we think of now as gatherings where Christians came together. There weren't altars like we have. It's a different time. And not all of those things are there yet. They're just not there in history. So I think that is actually, it brings me to a point that I realized I should have included in my notes and didn't, so there's even more. Just to sort of in broad brushstrokes talk about what happens. So arguably Jesus dies, rises from the dead, and ascends into heaven around 30 AD. It's possible to be a few years later. It's unlikely to be too much earlier than that, but it's around 30. The early Christians seem to have been concentrated most in the region of Galilee to the north, where Jesus spent most of his time, and near Jerusalem. There are some Jewish persecutions that break out. There's tension between the Jews and the early Christians in the synagogues. That breaks out into a full persecution around 36 AD when the apostle James, the son of Zebedee, dies. He's killed. He's the first apostle who is martyred. That likely happens around 36. As that persecution intensifies, that's actually part of what spreads Christianity more quickly. Some of the people that were at Pentecost do seem to have gone home and started telling people about what they encountered and what they heard. But for the most part, it seems like the great movement and the great evangelization energy started with that first persecution. Christians start moving north of the Holy Land into modern-day Syria toward Damascus. They start moving south, and by south we usually mean south and west toward Egypt. And to a certain extent they move east. Probably north and east most directly, because directly east of Israel is a giant desert and the Jordanian plateau, both of which are hard to cross in the ancient world, and they didn't do it very often. So there's this kind of nuclear stage. At that time, in those first years, the Christians are gathering and they're worshiping but they're still largely connected with synagogues. One of the things that I don't think we know very well is their connection to the temple. How did the relationship with the temple change? By the time of St. Paul, Paul is going to argue that it has changed completely. But he likely comes around that first persecution. Stephen, I think, so Paul's conversion is likely around that same time in 36 AD. I think that's where the martyrdom of Stephen happens and the early, that first persecution. It could be earlier. And then Paul does his thing for a while, and then he starts his great missionary journeys. He's not the only one. So the apostles start in various fits and things to start moving out of the Holy Land. But the major change happens by around 60, 65 AD. I forget exactly when it is. I should have looked it up. But anyone know what happens around 60, 65? What?
The destruction of the temple.
That happens in 70. This predates that a little bit, but that's the event that we're going for. So in the Holy Land, the tension between the Jews and the Romans is skyrocketing. There's bickering back and forth, there's small battles, and it breaks into open war. So the Romans end up withdrawing their legions from Israel for a time, and they regroup in modern-day Turkey, the Anatolian Plateau, where Rome had a bigger stronghold. And they gather troops, I think it was between 60 and 70,000 of them. I don't exactly remember. And by this time, Rome, I don't know how to describe it. By this time, they're impatient. And they're like, this annoying little gnat is now dead meat. Like, it has invaded my home, it's caused problems. And so when the Romans come marching back in, the Jews are done. Like, they surround cities, they besiege them, they rip them into pieces and knock them to the ground. Done. And kill all the people. Like, Rome's patience had run out. And so they attack Galilee before that, and Galilee is pacified. The Jewish garrisons are basically kicked out. And then the Romans start their march toward Jerusalem. They arrive in Jerusalem, I think, around 67. The siege of Jerusalem, it was a walled city. It was built on the top of hills, and it was very, very hard to take militarily. The siege of Jerusalem takes between 2 and 3 years. The Romans, I think in the final thing, they actually build a ramp of earth to the top of the Jewish fortress, the Fortress Antonia, on the north side of the temple. I think they build a ramp of earth there. They build it somewhere so that they basically can walk in. And they do that under heavy bombardment and fire from the Jewish garrison inside. But it gets so bad, the city runs out of food, they start eating each other, cannibalism, and on and on. The people from the countryside had retreated into Jerusalem. And so the city, by some estimates, swelled to something like 1 million people. And the Romans basically killed them all. By that time, the Christians had left. There's an event that happens where the Roman procurator takes one of the golden eagles. These legions carried the standard, a golden eagle, and they plant it in the temple. And that's kind of when the Jews are like, this is a sign of abomination. This is what Daniel warned us about. The Holy Spirit tells the Christians, like, now's the time to leave. And so the Christian people basically abandoned Jerusalem. As nearly as we can tell, very, very few of them stayed. They were warned very, very directly, like, this is what Jesus was talking about. This is it. This is the end. It's time to go. So they flee to a city in the desert called Petra. It's in modern-day Jordan. If you go on a Holy Land tour, they very often go over to Petra. It's carved out of this beautiful red sandstone. And eventually the Romans take the city. They burn the temple to the ground. It's one of the things, we'll talk about it in a little bit, but they have This is one of the times in history where you can really talk about bloodlust. People in the middle of a battle, when it gets bad enough and you're hard-pressed enough and things are crazy enough, you lose all connection with rationality and reality. And so they just start wholesale killing. That happens a lot in history. The Jews talk about so many people dying that the cities or the streets of the city ran like rivers of blood. And the reason why I think it's important to absorb some of that detail is to, first of all, realize this is a brutal world. This is a world of war. This is a world of fighting. And second of all, this event is like an earthquake that shocks Judaism. It changes the scene completely. That Roman destruction of the temple rearranges Judaism. It leads to the exaltation of the Pharisees, the rulers of the synagogues, because basically every other Jewish group is wiped out. The Sadducees are gone, the Essenes are gone, the Zealots are all dead, and so the Pharisees are the ones left, and that's how Judaism continues to develop. But it largely develops outside of the Holy Land. They have a few places that they keep along the coast, but they basically flee. The largest Jewish community, and therefore one of the largest early Christian communities, was in Alexandria in Egypt. It was the largest gathering of Jews outside of the Holy Land. Antioch in Syria, another very important early place. In fact, one of the pictures from the ancient world that's rather surprising is, with as strict as the Jewish laws were about diet and how you could live, there's Jewish synagogues basically everywhere that St. Paul goes. Remember that. That's actually relatively unique, because you'd think this religion from a Roman backwater province that really is important in the eyes of the world, it's not really on the map. It's not Rome. It's not Athens. It's just out there. It'd be like, some of the, Zip to Zap, North Dakota is barely on the map. That's kind of how the Romans thought of it. And that religion that was barely on the map had followers and adherents around the Mediterranean world. That's pretty unique. And that helps you realize that there had to be more Gentile converts and more people coming into Judaism than just a handful of Jews that fled the Holy Land at one time or another. Because otherwise those synagogues wouldn't have survived. Now, they probably aren't large monster churches. It's not St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, planted all over the empire. Churches weren't that big. In fact, the Christians don't really build churches at all until after the Edict of Toleration, the Edict of Milan, issued by Constantine in the 300s. There's a few that date from before that. There's a few places in the catacombs in Rome that are earlier than that, but the earliest churches that exist as churches, like we would recognize them today, date from that time of the 300s. Before that, they had house churches. They would use larger houses. So my point in saying this is that what happens is a spreading of Christianity and Christian missionaries, but it takes some time. And it often comes out as a result of these kind of earthquakes, the persecution that the Jews launch. Eventually the Jews kick the Christians out of the synagogues. They adopt an oath that the Christians can't say, and they start a lot more anti-Christian stuff in the Jewish synagogue. Lots of that remains a formal part of their ceremony today. That happens, I forget when that happens. I think it's after 50 AD, but it could be earlier. I'd have to look. But there's a pretty famous date when the Jewish authorities, by and large, kicked the Christians out of the synagogues. And that's when they seem to have developed more of their own house churches. Okay, so that's history in a few broad strokes. And those are just the broad strokes. This is why it took 15 pages. I asked Monsignor Schlesselman, he taught us church history in seminary, and I said, how did you ever get anywhere when there's so much to say? Because, I was hoping today to cover like 30 or 40 years, and we're going to be hard-pressed to get there. But here we go. So, Christianity at the death of Jesus. What do we know about it? We know that there was a cohort of close followers of Jesus that's probably small. I mean, if you just look statistically, it's likely that Jesus only preached to something in the neighborhood of 50,000 people in his life, which is smaller than a single Billy Graham crusade. You know, he didn't preach to millions. There's no YouTube. They didn't record him. You know, I wish he would have. It would have been great. I mean, you know, if I was doing it, I would tell Jesus to do it differently, but he didn't ask me, and that's probably a good thing. But he doesn't preach to all that many people himself. The early Christian community, those that are very, very committed to it, is likely quite small. Maybe a few hundred or a few thousand. There are groups of people that follow him, that stick to him very closely. Many of them are women. Not all of them show up in the Gospels, but they are there, and we know because there's stuff like they keep getting plucked out of obscurity and talked about. Matthias is one of them who becomes an apostle. They say that they need someone who has followed Jesus from the beginning, who has been with us from the very beginning. He's never been mentioned before. He wasn't in the story. And now they're saying, oh, he was there the whole time. There's a story of the apostles bickering about who's the greatest, and Jesus grabs a kid and places him in their midst. Where'd the kid come from? Because, you know, if you're reading the story, good, pious Catholic, okay, Jesus is talking to his apostles. You have Jesus. You have 12 men, 12 apostles. So who's the kid? Where did he come from? Because there's no kid in the story until Jesus grabs him. So you have to suspect that there were more people around Jesus than show up in the story. Like, that's the only way you can solve that. That's the only way you can make it work. Now, it's not likely that there were millions. Jesus didn't walk around in a mob, as nearly as we can tell, but there's definitely some. There are people who heard Jesus and encountered him, but remember that they don't even have the Gospels in this nuclear stage. There's the teaching of the 12 apostles. Some of them would have heard some of his parables. Their memory probably was a little bit better than ours because they had to remember a lot of things, but it probably wasn't all that great. So there's times where there's sort of strange things that happen. When Paul is preaching in one spot, he encounters people who've been baptized with the baptism of John. There were some missionaries had come earlier that knew who Jesus was and knew that he was the Son of God and some of what he did, but they didn't know about baptism. So they just didn't tell him that. And Paul's like, oh, well, we all need to kind of baptize you with the Jesus thing and not just with the baptism of John, you know, because it was different. They had never heard that before. So there's people that would come and they would have a story of encountering Jesus, and that's probably what a lot of the early Christian gatherings was people telling their stories about encountering Jesus and some of their thoughts about him. There doesn't seem to have been organization or leadership in the way of human organizations. It's not that the apostles weren't in charge, but no one really